Margaret Wilson pressed her weathered hands against the empty wooden crib that had sat in their spare bedroom for 23 years. The morning light filtered through the dusty window, casting shadows across baby blankets that had never been used. At 52, she had long passed the age when most women stop hoping, but every morning she whispered the same prayer that had become as natural as breathing. God, just give me one chance to be a mother. Her husband Henry found her there, as he had countless mornings before. At 55, his hair had turned completely gray, and the lines around his eyes told the story of a man who had watched his wife's heart break month after month, year after year. They had tried everything: fertility treatments that drained their savings, adoption applications that ended in rejection letters citing their age, and prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling and fall back down like rain. "Maybe we should donate these things," Henry said gently, touching a tiny yellow onesie that still had the tags on it. They both knew he didn't mean it. This room had become Margaret's sanctuary, the place where she came to remember the children who existed only in her dreams. "Not today," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with the weight of another sleepless night. "Today is October 15th. Do you remember what today is?" Henry's shoulders sagged slightly. Of course he remembered. 5 years ago today, they had received their final rejection letter from the adoption agency. "Too old," the social worker had said with practiced sympathy. "These children need parents who can keep up with them, who will be around to see them graduate college." The words had hit Margaret like physical blows, each one driving deeper into the wound that never seemed to heal. But Henry also remembered something else about October 15th. It was the day they had decided to take their weekly walk to the old train station where they had first met 30 years ago. Back then, Margaret had been a young teacher catching the morning train to the next town over, and Henry had been a construction worker heading to a job site. He had helped her carry a heavy box of school supplies, and she had smiled at him in a way that made the sun seem brighter. "Come on," Henry said, offering his arm to his wife. "Let's go for a walk. The fresh air will do us good." The abandoned train station sat on the outskirts of their small town like a forgotten memory. The Victorian-era building had once been the pride of the community, with its ornate architecture and bustling platform where families gathered to welcome loved ones home or say tearful goodbyes. Now, weeds grew between the railway ties, and the old wooden benches sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. Margaret and Henry walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk that led to the platform. The October air was crisp and carried the scent of dying leaves. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as they approached the place where their love story had begun, now serving as a weekly pilgrimage to simpler times when they still believed all their dreams would come true. That's when they heard it. A sound so faint at first that Margaret thought she was imagining it. A soft whimpering, like the cry of a kitten or perhaps the wind playing tricks on old wood and rusty metal. But as they drew closer to the platform, the sound became clearer, more distinct, and unmistakably human. "Henry," Margaret whispered, gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Do you hear that?" The crying was coming from behind a stack of old luggage that had been left on the platform years ago when the last train departed. Henry approached carefully, his heart hammering in his chest. What they found that would change their lives forever. Nestled between two battered suitcases was a wicker basket lined with soft church blankets. Inside, two tiny newborns lay sleeping fitfully, their small faces red from crying, their little fists clenched as if they were fighting some invisible battle. They couldn't have been more than a few hours old, their umbilical cord stumps still fresh, their skin still bearing the wrinkled appearance of brand new life. Margaret's knees nearly gave out. She had dreamed of this moment so many times that for a second she wondered if she was still asleep in that empty nursery. But the baby's cries were real, their need was urgent, and every maternal instinct she had buried over the years came flooding back like a dam breaking. "Oh my God," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside the basket. "Henry, look at them. They're so small, so perfect. Tucked beneath the blankets was a handwritten note on paper that looked like it had been torn from a church bulletin. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Please love them like I cannot. Give them the life I can't provide. I chose you because I've watched you here, and I know you understand love and loss. They deserve better than I can give them. A mother who tried. Margaret read the note 3 times before the words fully registered. Someone had been watching them during their weekly visits. Someone had seen their pain and recognized it as proof of their capacity to love. Someone had chosen them. We have to take them to the hospital, Henry said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was already calculating in his mind the questions that would be asked, the authorities that would be called, the system that would separate these babies from their arms before they even had a chance to hold them properly. But Margaret was already lifting the first baby, a tiny girl with a tuft of dark hair and rosebud lips that were searching for comfort. The moment the infant settled against Margaret's chest, something magical happened. The crying stopped. The little body relaxed. And for the first time in 23 years, Margaret felt complete. "Henry," she said, tears streaming down her face as she cradled the baby girl, "this is Grace. And this," she said, nodding toward the baby boy who was now stirring in the basket, "is Ethan. They're ours. God brought them to us." Henry wanted to argue, to be practical, to think about legalities and proper procedures. But when Margaret placed Ethan in his arms, and the baby boy opened his eyes and looked directly at him with that unfocused but somehow knowing gaze that newborns possess, all his objections melted away. They stood there on that forgotten platform, holding the children they had prayed for, while the October wind whispered through the abandoned station like a blessing. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. Mrs. Patterson, the town's biggest gossip, who had been on her way to the post office when she spotted the unusual scene. As Margaret and Henry made their way home with their precious cargo, Mrs. Patterson was already reaching for her phone. She had recognized the babies immediately from the whispered rumors that had been circulating for days about a young girl who had gone missing from the next town over. And she knew exactly who to call. The first domino in a chain reaction that would divide their entire town was about to fall. The spare bedroom that had been a shrine to lost hopes transformed into something magical overnight. Margaret moved with purpose she hadn't felt in decades, her hands steady as she pulled dusty baby clothes from storage boxes that had sat untouched for years. The tiny yellow onesies, soft blankets, and miniature socks suddenly had meaning again. Henry assembled the crib they had bought optimistically 15 years ago, his weathered hands working with the careful precision of a man who understood that some dreams are worth waiting for. Grace lay peacefully in Margaret's arms while Ethan rested in the bassinet they had set up temporarily beside their bed. Every few minutes, Margaret would check their breathing, count their fingers and toes again, and marvel at the miracle that had literally been placed in their path. Henry watched his wife transform before his eyes. The defeated woman who had whispered prayers to empty rooms was gone, replaced by a mother whose every instinct had awakened with fierce intensity. "I need to call Dr. Williams," Henry said quietly as Margaret changed Grace's diaper with surprising skill. "They need to be examined properly." Dr. Williams had been their family physician for over 20 years. He had been there through all of Margaret's fertility treatments, had held her hand through miscarriages, and had gently suggested they stop trying when her body couldn't take any more disappointment. When Henry called that morning, explaining the situation in careful terms, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Bring them in through the back entrance," Dr. Williams finally said. "And Henry, don't mention this to anyone else yet. Let me examine them first, then we'll figure out what needs to be done." The examination revealed what Margaret's heart already knew. Both babies were healthy, though slightly underweight and dehydrated. Grace weighed 5 pounds, 2 ounces, while Ethan was slightly larger at 5 pounds, 8 ounces. Dr. Williams estimated they were born within the last 24 hours, possibly delivered without medical assistance. They're going to need frequent feeding, Dr. Williams explained, showing Margaret how to prepare formula and teaching Henry the proper way to birth them. Every 2 to 3 hours around clock. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? Margaret's answer came without hesitation. I've been preparing for this my entire life. That first week passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and the sweet exhaustion that comes with caring for newborns. Margaret barely slept, but she had never felt more alive. Henry took over all the household duties, cooking simple meals and handling the laundry, while his wife focused entirely on the babies. Watching her rock Grace to sleep while humming lullabies she had memorized years ago, Henry felt his own heart expanding in ways he hadn't thought possible at his age. By Sunday, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. "We're taking them to church," she announced as she dressed Grace in a white dress that had been waiting in tissue paper for over a decade. Henry hesitated. Maybe we should wait a bit longer, until we sort out the legal aspects. But Margaret's mind was made up. These children are a blessing, and I want our community to meet them. Pastor Williams blessed our marriage 30 years ago. I want him to bless our family. The sanctuary of First Methodist Church had never felt more sacred to Margaret than it did that morning. She carried Grace while Henry held Ethan, and they walked down the center aisle to their usual pew in the third row. The hushed conversations that followed their entrance were impossible to ignore, but Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the altar where a simple wooden cross reminded her that miracles still happen in ordinary places. Pastor Williams, Dr. Williams' younger brother, had known about the baby's arrival. His sermon that morning seemed directed specifically at their situation. Every child is a gift from God, placed in the arms of those who will love them most. We do not question his timing or his methods. We simply trust in his wisdom. After the service, the reactions were mixed. Sarah Mitchell, a young mother with 3 children of her own, approached with tears in her eyes. "They're beautiful," she whispered, touching Grace's tiny hand. "If you need anything, bottles, diapers, advice, please call me. I know how overwhelming it can be." But not everyone was as welcoming. Margaret overheard Mrs. Patterson speaking in hushed tones near the fellowship hall. "It's not natural a woman her age try to raise babies. Those children need young parents, not grandparents playing house." The words stung, but they also strengthened Margaret's resolve. She had waited 23 years for this moment, and no amount of gossip would diminish her joy. That evening, as both babies slept peacefully in their new nursery, Margaret and Henry sat together on their couch, sharing a quiet cup of coffee. For the first time in their marriage, their house felt complete. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Henry took her hand, noting how much steadier it seemed than it had been just a week ago. "Look at them, Maggie. Look at how they've thrived in just 7 days. Look at yourself. You're glowing like you did when I first met you. If this isn't right, I don't know what is." But even as they spoke, Mrs. Patterson was 3 blocks away, dialing a number she had found in the county directory. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, and very interested in what she had to report. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret and Henry had become parents, and their daily routine had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Margaret had mastered the art of simultaneous bottle feeding, holding Grace in one arm while Ethan nestled against her other side. Henry had learned to change diapers with military precision and could identify each baby's different cries from 3 rooms away. The nursery that had once echoed with silence now hummed with the soft sounds of life. Gentle breathing, contented sighs, and the occasional whimper that brought instant parental attention. But their peaceful world shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when Sheriff Morrison's patrol car pulled into their driveway. Margaret was feeding Grace when she saw the black and white vehicle through the kitchen window. Her hands began to tremble so violently that Henry had to take the baby from her arms. They both knew this moment would come eventually, but knowing and preparing were 2 entirely different things. Sheriff Morrison was a kind man who had grown up in their town, played baseball with Henry in high school, and had always tipped his hat respectfully to Margaret at the grocery store. But today he wore his official face, the one reserved for difficult conversations and unpleasant duties. "Margaret, Henry," he said, removing his hat as they invited him inside. "I'm sure you know why I'm here." "The babies," Margaret whispered, instinctively moving closer to the nursery where Ethan was sleeping. "We've received several calls about 2 infants in your care," Sheriff Morrison continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to ask you some questions about how they came to be here." For the next hour, Margaret and Henry recounted their story. The weekly walks to the train station, the discovery of the basket, the note from the biological mother, their decision to bring the children home. Sheriff Morrison took careful notes, asking questions about exact times, whether they had seen anyone else at the station, and why they hadn't immediately contacted authorities. "We were going to," Henry said, though the words sounded weak even to him. "We just wanted to make sure they were healthy first." The sheriff's expression remained neutral, but Margaret could read the doubt in his eyes. "I've checked missing persons reports from 3 counties," he said. "No reports of missing newborns matching their description. No reports of pregnant women who have disappeared. It's like these babies appeared out of thin air." That afternoon, a second visitor arrived. Ms. Janet Torres from Social Services was younger than Margaret had expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes, but clipboard that represented everything Margaret feared most. She examined the nursery with professional thoroughness, noting the quality of care, the cleanliness of the environment, and the obvious love that had been poured into every detail. "The babies appeared to be thriving," Ms. Torres admitted, watching Henry expertly burp Ethan after his afternoon feeding. "They're gaining weight appropriately, their developmental responses are normal, and they're clearly bonded to you both." Margaret felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the social worker's next words. "However, there are serious legal complications here. Proper adoption procedures weren't followed. There's no record of maternal consent. And frankly, your ages are a concern. At 52 and 55, you're well beyond the typical age range we approve for infant adoption." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Everything she had feared was being laid out in clinical terms by a woman who had never experienced the desperate hunger for a child that had consumed her for over 2 decades. "These children need us," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Look at them. Look how happy and healthy they are. Isn't that what matters most?" But Ms. Torres was bound by regulations and procedures. "I'm required to file a report recommending temporary foster placement while we investigate the circumstances of their abandonment. I'm sorry, but it's protocol." Word of the investigation spread through town like wildfire. Mrs. Patterson had made sure of that, sharing her concerns with anyone who would listen at the grocery store, the post office, and her weekly bridge club. The community began to divide into distinct camps. Dr. Williams publicly supported the couple, telling anyone who asked that the babies had received excellent care and were developing perfectly. Pastor Williams devoted his Wednesday evening sermon to the topic of compassion in God's mysterious ways. Sarah Mitchell organized a group of young mothers who volunteered to help with childcare and support. But the opposition was vocal and growing. At Morrison's Hardware, men questioned Henry about proper procedures and wondered aloud whether older parents were being selfish. At the beauty salon, women debated whether children deserved energetic parents who could keep up with their needs. The phrase "too old to be parents" appeared in conversations with increasing frequency. Margaret stopped going to the grocery store when she overheard 2 women discussing her situation in the cereal aisle. "It's not natural," one said. "Women her age should be grandmothers, not trying to chase toddlers." "Those babies deserve better," the other agreed. "Parents who'll live to see them graduate." Each cruel comment felt like a nail being driven into her heart. But Margaret's resolve only grew stronger. Every time she looked at Grace and Ethan, Every time they smiled at the sound of her voice or settled peacefully in her arms, she knew with absolute certainty that they belonged together. The official notice arrived on a Friday evening, slipped under their door like a death sentence. Margaret's hand shook as she read the formal language. Mandatory town hall hearing, custody of unnamed infants, November 15th, 7 p.m. Their worst nightmare was about to begin. The Riverside Community Center had never hosted such a packed, tense gathering. By 6:30, every folding chair was occupied, and late arrivals stood along the walls like soldiers preparing for battle. Margaret sat in the front row, clutching Henry's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white, while Grace and Ethan slept peacefully in their car seats, blissfully unaware that their entire future hung in the balance. Judge Patricia Coleman, who usually handled small claims and traffic violations, looked uncomfortable presiding over what had essentially become a town-wide custody battle. Local news reporter Janet Hayes sat in the back corner with her camera crew, turning their private heartbreak into public entertainment. Mrs. Patterson rose first to address the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself spokesperson for the opposition. At 68, she commanded respect in the community as a former school principal and longtime church member. Your Honor, we're here tonight because we care about these innocent babies who cannot speak for themselves, she began, her gray hair perfectly styled and her Sunday dress lending gravity to her words. Margaret and Henry Wilson are good people, but good intentions don't make good parents for newborns. She turned to face the crowd, her voice growing stronger. These children will need parents who can run after them in playgrounds, attend their high school graduations, walk them down the aisle at their weddings. Margaret is 52 years old. Henry is 55. When these babies graduate high school, their parents will be 70 years old. Is that fair to ask of children who have already been abandoned once? Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the crowd. Margaret felt each word like a physical blow, but she forced herself to sit straight and maintain her dignity. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson continued, proper legal procedures exist for a reason. These babies were found abandoned, with no official documentation, no medical records, no legal consent for adoption. The Wilsons bypassed every safeguard designed to protect children and simply took them home like stray pets. What kind of precedent does this set? When she sat down, the applause from her supporters was loud and sustained. Judge Coleman called Pastor Williams to speak next. The elderly minister approached the microphone with the slow dignity of his 82 years, but his voice was clear and strong. I have known Margaret and Henry Wilson for 30 years, he began. I performed their wedding ceremony in this very building back when it was still the old Methodist church. I have watched them endure heartbreak that would have destroyed lesser people. I have seen Margaret volunteer countless hours in our church nursery, loving other people's children with the same devotion most parents reserve for their own. He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Patterson. Edna, you speak of age as if it disqualifies love. Moses was 80 when God called him to lead the Israelites. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. Age brings wisdom, patience, and appreciation for life's precious gifts. The pastor's words seemed to shift the energy in the room. Several elderly couples nodded their approval. Dr. Williams was called next, carrying a folder of medical records. From a purely medical standpoint, both infants have thrived under Margaret and Henry's care. Grace has gained 14 ounces in 3 weeks. Ethan has gained 16 ounces. Their developmental milestones are all appropriate. Their feeding schedules are consistent, their hygiene is exemplary, and their emotional attachment to their caregivers is strong and healthy. He looked up from his notes. I have examined thousands of infants in my career, and I can tell you without hesitation that these babies are receiving excellent care from parents who love them deeply. Sarah Mitchell asked to speak next, her voice trembling with emotion. I'm 32 years old with 3 children of my own, and I can barely manage some days. But when I watch Margaret with Grace and Ethan, I see something beautiful. She has the patience that comes from waiting 23 years for this moment. She has the wisdom that comes from loss and heartbreak. She has the energy that comes from pure love. Sarah's words brought tears to many eyes, but they also triggered angry responses from the opposition. "It's not about love," shouted Tom Bradley, a young father of two. "It's about being realistic. These babies will be orphaned again when their elderly parents die. They'll spend their teenage years caring for aging grandparents instead of being children." The room erupted in arguments, voices rising as neighbors who had known each other for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible debate. Judge Coleman banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Margaret finally stood, her legs shaky but her voice clear. "May I speak for myself?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the woman at the center of the controversy, holding a baby bottle she had been warming throughout the hearing. "I know I'm not young," she said quietly, her words carrying to every corner of the packed room. "I know I can't promise I'll live to see these children grow old, but I can promise that every day I have with them will be filled with more love than some children receive in entire lifetimes." Her voice grew stronger. "Age didn't stop me from loving every baby in our church nursery for 20 years. Age didn't stop me from teaching Sunday school or volunteering at the children's hospital. Age hasn't stopped me from getting up every 3 hours for the past month to feed Grace and Ethan, and it won't stop me tomorrow." Judge Coleman studied the crowd, then looked at her notes. "This is an unprecedented situation requiring careful consideration. I'm postponing my decision for 48 hours to review all testimony and consult with state authorities on proper procedures." As the crowd dispersed, Margaret overheard Mrs. Patterson talking to the reporter. "Mark my words, those babies will be in proper foster care by the weekend." The 48 hours felt like 48 years. Margaret barely slept, spending most nights standing over Grace and Ethan's cribs, memorizing their peaceful faces in case these were her last moments as their mother. Henry found her there Friday morning, still in her nightgown, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered lullabies to babies who might be taken from her arms before the sun set again. The phone had been ringing constantly with reporters wanting statements, neighbors offering support or criticism, and officials confirming details for the afternoon hearing. Henry had stopped answering after the third call from a television station in the state capitol wanting to film their story. At 2 o'clock, as Margaret was preparing Grace's afternoon bottle, a soft knock came at their front door. Henry peered through the window and saw a young woman standing on their porch, nervously shifting from foot to foot. She looked to be in her late teens, with long brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. Her face was pale and streaked with tears. "We're not talking to reporters," Henry called through the door. "I'm not a reporter," the girl said, her voice barely audible through the glass. "Please, I need to talk to you about the babies. Those babies, they're mine." Margaret's bottle slipped from her hands, formula splashing across the kitchen floor as she rushed to the door. Henry's hand hesitated on the doorknob for a moment before he slowly opened it to reveal the young woman who held the key to their future. "My name is Rachel Stevens," she said, looking directly at Margaret with eyes that held the same desperate hope Margaret had carried for 23 years. "I'm 19 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I gave birth to twins at the county hospital. I'm her biological mother." Margaret's legs gave out, and Henry caught her before she collapsed. They guided Rachel to their living room, where Grace was sleeping in her bouncer and Ethan was lying on a blanket, trying to focus his newborn eyes on a mobile of dancing bears. "Oh God," Rachel whispered, covering her face with her hands. "They're so beautiful. They're so much bigger than when I left them." The story came out in broken pieces, interrupted by sobs and long pauses as Rachel struggled to find words for the most difficult decision of her young life. She had grown up in foster care after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. At 18, she had aged out of the system with nowhere to go and no family support. She had been living in a women's shelter when she met David, a charming 22-year-old who promised her love and stability. When I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared the same day, Rachel said, her voice hollow with remembered pain. Left town without a word. The shelter could only keep me until the babies were born. And then what? I had no job, no money, no way to take care of one baby, let alone two. She looked up at Margaret with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. I watched you and your husband at the train station for weeks before I made my decision. Every Sunday after church, you would walk there together, and I could see the sadness in your faces. The way you looked at each other, the way you touched that old bench where you used to sit. I asked people in town about you. Margaret's heart was racing. You chose us. Rachel nodded through her tears. Mrs. Mitchell at the grocery store told me about your fertility struggles, about all the adoption attempts that fell through. Dr. Williams' receptionist mentioned how you volunteered with babies at the church nursery for 20 years, even though it broke your heart every time. I realized you weren't just any couple walking through that station. You were parents waiting for your children. She wiped her nose with a tissue Henry offered her. I delivered the twins at the county hospital, but I told them I needed time to think about adoption paperwork. I brought them home to the shelter for one night, and I held them and fed them and told them how much I loved them. And then I made the hardest decision of my life. Rachel's voice broke completely. I wrote that note at 3 in the morning while they slept. I wanted you to know that leaving them wasn't abandonment. It was love. It was choosing the parents I wished I could have had, the parents they deserved. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of the babies breathing. Margaret reached across the space between them and took Rachel's hands in hers. You gave us the greatest gift imaginable, Margaret whispered. But why are you here now? Why didn't you come forward during the investigation? Rachel's face crumpled. Because I was scared. Because I thought if I stayed hidden, you could just keep them without all this legal mess. But then I heard about the hearing, about people saying you were too old, about them wanting to take Grace and Ethan away from you. And I realized I had to speak up. She stood up shakily and looked directly at Margaret. I'm going to that hearing tonight. I'm going to tell everyone that I chose you as their parents. And I'm going to make sure no one can ever take them away from you. Outside, Mrs. Patterson was walking past with her evening constitutional when she saw the unknown young woman through the window. She had no idea that everything she had said and done over the past month was about to be proven devastatingly wrong. The emergency town hall meeting that evening was even more crowded than the first one. Word had spread quickly that there would be a major development in the Wilson custody case, and curiosity had drawn nearly every resident of their small town. Margaret and Henry sat in the same front row seats, but this time they weren't alone. Rachel Stevens sat beside them, her hands trembling but her jaw set with determination. Judge Coleman called the session to order and looked directly at Rachel. Miss Stevens, I understand you have testimony relevant to this case. Rachel stood slowly, her legs unsteady as she approached the microphone. The room was so quiet that the sound of her footsteps echoed off the walls. When she reached the podium, she gripped its edges and took a deep breath that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. My name is Rachel Stevens, she began, her young voice carrying clearly through the packed room. 3 weeks ago, I gave birth to the twins you've all been arguing about. Grace and Ethan are my biological children. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Several people in the audience leaned forward, straining to hear what came next. I was 19 years old, homeless and alone. Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The father abandoned me when he found out I was pregnant. I had no family, no support system, and no way to provide for one baby, let alone two. But I also couldn't bear the thought of giving them to strangers through some cold, bureaucratic system. She turned to look directly at Margaret and Henry. So I watched, and I waited, and I chose. I spent weeks observing Margaret and Henry Wilson, learning about their character, their love for each other, and their desperate desire to be parents. I didn't abandon my babies at that train station. I placed them exactly where I knew they would be found by the people I had carefully selected to raise them. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Coleman had to bang her gavel several times to restore order. Rachel faced the audience again, tears streaming down her face, but her voice unwavering. Every person in this room who has criticized Margaret and Henry for their age, who has questioned their fitness as parents, who has suggested those babies deserve someone younger, you have insulted my decision as their birth mother. You have second-guessed the choice I made with more love and careful consideration than any of you put into choosing what to have for breakfast. Mrs. Patterson stood up abruptly. But the legal procedures, Rachel interrupted, her voice sharp with emotion, would have separated my children from the parents I chose for them and placed them with complete strangers. I chose Margaret and Henry Wilson to be Grace and Ethan's parents, and I stand by that choice completely. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. I have here a notarized statement of voluntary relinquishment, witnessed by 2 social workers at the county office this afternoon. I am formally and legally consenting to Margaret and Henry Wilson adopting my children. Dr. Williams stood up in the audience. Your Honor, I'd like to add that in 3 weeks under the Wilsons' care, these babies have thrived beyond all expectations. They've gained weight appropriately, met all developmental milestones, and formed secure attachments. From a medical standpoint, there is no question they are receiving excellent care. Pastor Williams rose next. And from a spiritual standpoint, I have rarely witnessed such devoted, loving parents. Age is merely a number when measured against the depth of love these people have shown. One by one, supporters began standing throughout the room. Sarah Mitchell and her husband, the elderly couple who ran the hardware store. Even some of the younger parents who had initially opposed the adoption found themselves reconsidering their positions in light of Rachel's testimony. Mrs. Patterson remained seated, her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized how completely wrong she had been. Finally, she stood slowly and cleared her throat. I owe Margaret and Henry an apology, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I spoke out of prejudice and ignorance. If their birth mother chose them after careful consideration, then who am I to question that wisdom? Judge Coleman studied the document Rachel had provided, consulted with the court clerk, and finally looked up at the packed room. Based on the voluntary consent of the biological mother and the clear evidence that these children are thriving in their current placement, I am approving the adoption petition of Margaret and Henry Wilson. The age waiver is granted due to the exceptional circumstances of this case. The room erupted in applause. Margaret collapsed into Henry's arms, sobbing with relief and joy. Rachel approached them hesitantly, and Margaret immediately pulled her into their embrace. Thank you, Margaret whispered through her tears. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for trusting us with your precious gifts. 6 months later, Grace and Ethan Wilson celebrated their first Christmas in a house filled with extended family that included not only Margaret and Henry, but also Rachel, who visited monthly and had become like a daughter to them. Mrs. Patterson, true to her word, had become one of their strongest supporters and self-appointed honorary grandmother. The old train station had been converted into a community adoption support center, funded by donations from townspeople who had learned that love comes in many forms and that families are built by choice as much as by blood. Margaret still whispered prayers every morning, but now they were prayers of gratitude for the miracle that had transformed their empty nest into a home filled with the laughter of children who had found their way to exactly where they belonged.